and welcome to our second lecture on the Second World War. In this lecture, we're going to be examining the rise of Hitler's Nazi Party in Germany and the ideological and geopolitical wellsprings of his foreign policy. We will trace his step-by-step revision of the Treaty of Versailles and also look at the rhetorical style, the way he presented his demands for change, both to the international community as well as to the German population at home. We've been talking about the problems of the international system and the legacy of the First World War for the background of the Second. And I think what one needs to emphasize, even before Hitler's rise to power, is that already by the end of the 1920s, the international system as it had been envisioned by those diplomats who had framed the Treaty of Versailles was already tattered, if not destroyed, certainly tattered. Without the steadfast support of the British, and the United States' absence, France found itself in a position of having to, it felt, maintain, enforce the Treaty of Versailles virtually alone. The British had reneged on their guarantees to France when the United States had failed to ratify the Anglo-American guarantee. And without Russia, France was forced to rely on, it felt, on the new so-called successor states of Eastern Europe, those states that had been created, really, out of the collapse of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire. So that France had, in the 1920s, begun to establish a set of military alliances with Poland, with Czechoslovakia, had made an agreement with Yugoslavia and with Romania in the east, and also with Belgium in the west. But these states, particularly those in the east, were hardly a substitute, hardly a replacement for Russia. The big problem for France was to find a counterbalance to German power in the east. The old Tsarist Empire had provided this for the French in the pre-war era, and now the Soviet Union was not seen as a reliable alternative. So France struggles all the way through the 1920s, trying to find a way to manage this situation. In the 20s, and certainly after the mid-1920s, these problems were largely manageable. In 1924, the German government had embarked upon what was called the policy of fulfillment. Gustav Stresemann was the chancellor briefly of Germany in 1923. He would become foreign minister of Germany in 24 and would dominate German foreign policy through the last portion of the 1920s. Stresemann was convinced, as were all German politicians, that the Treaty of Versailles was brutally unfair, that it had to be revised. But, he argued to his friends at home and to the international community, Germany's attempts to frustrate the Allies, the Germans from 1920 down to 1923, had tried not to pay reparations, to fudge this and that, complained certainly just continued to argue that the treaty was unfair and to be obstreperous. Stresemann argued that a new tact was now required. What Germany should do is to follow what he called the policy of fulfillment. Erfüllungspolitik is the German term. What this meant was to make a good faith effort to fulfill all of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, no matter how unfair they were seen as being. And by that good faith attempt, Germany would demonstrate, even to the French, that the treaty had been, in fact, impossible, that its terms could not be fulfilled, and therefore a revision of the treaty would take place, but through negotiation. Not confrontation, negotiation. In this sense, Germany, between 1924 and 1925, entered into a series of international agreements which reintegrated Germany into the community of nations. In 1925, Germany signed the Locarno Treaty, in which it basically recognized the frontiers that had been redrawn in the West. In 1926, Germany applied for membership and was received in the League of Nations, something Germany had not been allowed to do previously. In 1928, Germany would be a signatory to the so-called Kellogg-Briand Pact, a non-aggression pact in which all states pledged themselves to resolve all of their differences amicably. I think one could find a similar non-aggression pact in almost every decade of the 20th century and beyond, looking backward, one no more effective than the other. The United States, during this period, was certainly active in economic matters. The United States had become involved with the so-called Dawes Plan, named for the American Charles Dawes, the vice president. to help Europe settle, to sort out its reparations problems, its war debt problems. But the United States still remained on the sidelines. It was not the party to the various treaties that would be signed in Europe, other than this Kellogg-Briand Pact. But all of this attempt at negotiation on the part of Stresemann, this attempt to reintegrate Germany into the community of nations, which had taken up much of the last part of the 1920s, would all come to a crashing halt when the stock market crashed on Wall Street in the fall of 1929. The Great Depression would hit Germany like a steamroller. Germany, more than any other country other than the United States, was powerfully affected by the Great Depression. Germany was quickly exposed to, because Germany had taken many short-term loans from private sources in the United States, those loans were withdrawn suddenly in 1929 and early 1930, and the impact of the Depression was astounding. Germany's unemployment rate would jump massively between 1928 and 1932. By 1932, 1/3 of the German workforce was either unemployed or working drastically reduced hours, 1/3. In addition, a tidal wave of failed businesses, especially of small shops, and farm foreclosures simply swamped the country. The businesses failed right and left. Those German businesses that had somehow managed to get through the turbulent post-war era up to 1924, a hyperinflation in Germany of absolutely hyperbolic proportions, managed to get through a harsh period of stabilization in the latter part of the 20s, now found themselves swept away by the Great Depression between 1928 and 1933. As a consequence, these economic problems fed what in Germany was called an anti-system, anti-Republican sentiment, an anti-Republican bitterness that held the Democratic Republic of Germany responsible for these failed economic problems. Now not only was the German government, this Republican government established by revolution in 1918 with a new constitution in 1919, not only was it held responsible for the loss of the Great War and the Treaty of Versailles, it seemed to have delivered to the Germans one economic crisis after another, with the Great Depression being the final punctuation mark on that unhappy economic development. Adolf Hitler's National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, had less than 3% of the vote in 1928 before the effects of the Depression hit Germany. In 1930, the vote jumped to 18%. In the summer of 1932, the National Socialists, the Nazis, received about 37% of the vote. It was the most votes, the largest percentage of votes the Nazis would ever receive in anything like free elections. And in the elections at the end of the year, in November, the Nazi vote actually declined. This very difficult coalition that the Nazis had put together of diverse social forces, put together largely on the basis of what we would think of as negative campaigning. What are you opposed to? We're opposed to it too. Are you unhappy? Well, we're more unhappier than you are. We're going to solve your problems. Hitler was appointed chancellor on January 30th, 1933, in I think one of the cruelest ironies of all of human history, at just the point when the Nazis themselves believed that their constituency was fragmenting, coming apart at the seams. Hitler was appointed chancellor not on the shoulders of a groundswell of public support, but rather as a result of a backdoor intrigue with the President Hindenburg, Paul von Hindenburg, the great hero of the First World War. There was nothing in the National Socialist approach to foreign policy during Hitler's rise to power that would necessarily have distinguished it from other German parties. It was a bit more radical, but it was opposed to Versailles. So were the communists, so were the conservatives, so were the liberals, so were the Social Democrats who'd signed the treaty. The Nazis, however, hammered away. They'd never been in power in Germany. As a consequence, they were able to relentlessly attack the failures of the other parties, relentlessly attack the failed Republican government. And of course, the Nazis put forward a promise to restore Germany to its rightful position in the world. Now, other parties had talked about this as well, but they were talking about compromise with the West. Could we see if we could get the reparations done away with? Just as in domestic politics, sober politicians would talk to their economic advisors and say, well, in order to pull Germany out of the Depression, we must do this, we must do that. And then there would be a huge debate, of course. No, one can't do this. That's if you try to reduce prices, this will happen, that will happen. The Nazi position to all of this was, when people pointed out the contradictions of their own economic policy, the Nazis would simply respond, "We will make it work." There will be a triumph of the will over all of the sort of naysaying liberals and social democrats and so on. We will make it work. And that same forceful projection of determination was also there in foreign policy. They would not simply revise the treaty, they would break the chains of Versailles. They would restore Germany to its rightful position in Europe and in the world. Upon coming to power, for the first 2 years, really, of the National Socialist regime in 1933 and 1934, Hitler's attention was largely focused on domestic policy, establishing the framework of the National Socialist dictatorship, defeating his domestic enemies, establishing really the foundations of what we would think of as a totalitarian regime. But Hitler would also have departures in foreign policy that were quite important. But before turning to the specifics of Nazi policy, I want to say a few words about Hitler's overall conception of the international system, his conception of international politics, how he wanted to operate, how he viewed the world, and how he hoped to see what his objectives were and how he hoped to see those objectives realized. There's a tendency, I think, to view Hitler as, especially in his foreign policy, as a madman, as a megalomaniac bent on world domination. There was a song within the Nazi Party that was sung during the rise to power, the lyrics of which were "Heute da hört uns Deutschland und morgen die ganze Welt." That means today Germany listens to us, tomorrow the whole world. But just a slight change of wording in German, they would sing "Heute gehört uns Deutschland und morgen die ganze Welt," which means today Germany belongs to us and tomorrow the whole world. I think there is a tendency to think that this is the way Hitler in his foreign policy operated, but in fact Hitler was far more cautious. He operated from a notion of the international system that was quite concise for him. He believed that the world would ultimately be divided into 4 major power blocks, a multipolar world, to use the post-World War II terminology for it. Germany's rightful position would be to dominate the European continent. It would be the great hegemonic power of Europe. The British would be able to maintain their international empire, their global empire. Hitler saw Britain in a very favorable light, was, I think, obsessed with them in many ways, frustrated with the British, as we will see. But in his overall thinking, Germany was to dominate the landmass of Europe, Britain was to have its international empire. The Japanese would be the dominant power in Asia. They were, Hitler liked to call them, the Aryans of the East. Japan would dominate Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And then finally there would be the United States, which would dominate the Western Hemisphere. In the long run, Hitler believed that the United States was doomed, too much racial mixture and so on, and this would ultimately bring the United States down. But in terms of the way he operated and thought, these were the 4 great blocks of power with which he had to deal. For Germany, his goals were also clear. He spelled them out in Mein Kampf, his political testament autobiography, which he wrote in prison in 1924, published in 1925. And then he, in a second book, a book that was never published during his lifetime, appeared only after the Second World War, called sometimes Hitler's Second Book or Hitler's Secret Book, in which he dealt very specifically with foreign policy. What were Germany's objectives? What did Hitler want for Germany? What was he trying to achieve? At one level, Hitler's goals were geopolitical, almost traditional. Germany, he felt, needed Lebensraum, or living space. The German population needed to increase, to grow, and Germany, which already was not economically self-sufficient in 1914, it imported about 20% of its food, and hence was successfully blockaded, virtually starved by the British after 1916. Hitler believed that Germany should be economically self-sufficient, capable of withstanding any sort of Allied blockade a la the First World War. Lebensraum, then, and where was that living space to come? Well, it was to come in the East. Germany would have to expand into the so-called successor states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and of course beyond beckoned the Ukraine, the great agricultural areas of now the Soviet Union. So living space, and what the Germans called economic autarky, that is economic self-sufficiency. In addition, however, there was an ideological dimension to Hitler's foreign policy, an ideological level which saturated these geopolitical ideas. So far, in thinking about what he thought about for Germany, there was nothing really to distinguish it terribly from some of the more radical framers of or advisors to the Kaiser. During the First World War, the idea of a Großdeutsches Reich, a greater German Reich, with territory in the East was quite common among many on the German right during the First World War. But for Hitler, there was the second dimension. The new greater German Reich, greater German Empire that was to be created, that was to dominate the European continent, was to be a racially pure empire. He believed that Germany was what one might call the last best racial hope of mankind. He didn't argue. This is a point that we will come back to when we see the terrible consequences of this ideology. Hitler didn't believe that the Germans were a master race, and Herrenvolk is the term, in the 1920s, 30s, or 40s. But the historic goal of Germany was to concentrate as best it could to bring together the racial stock, the undiluted racial stock of the Aryans, these sort of blonde-haired, blue-eyed types, and that the Germans were best able to do this. This meant creating a Reich, a Central European empire that would be free of Slavs, so the Polish or Czech or Slovak elements would have to be expelled or simply done away with. And of course for Hitler, central to this too was the idea of the Jews. The Jews would have to go. They would have to be eliminated. He talked about this in general terms. The Jews would have to go. It was not simply, however, a racial notion. Hitler always talked, when he talked about foreign policy, or domestic policy in many cases as well, about what he called the threat of Judeo-Bolshevism. Germany, indeed the world, was threatened by this Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy with its home, its center in the Soviet Union. Therefore, it was to be one of the great objectives of the National Socialist state of the Third Reich to conduct a crusade against Judeo-Bolshevism. So a war for living space in the East, which would obviously mean, and he didn't believe that these goals could be achieved peacefully. He believed, and this is much of what Nazi ideology was about, in a kind of social Darwinistic notion of the survival of the fittest, that life was struggle, that international politics was the struggle of nations, and that it would be Germany's task to expand to the East, and that did not mean through negotiation. It meant war. He calculated, he talked quite often about the prospect of war with Poland or with Czechoslovakia, and then ultimately beyond that, a war against the Soviet Union. A war not only for living space, but also as seen as an ideological crusade against what he saw as Judeo-Bolshevism. Needless to say, what this meant was not a revision of the Treaty of Versailles. This meant the destruction of the Treaty of Versailles. It meant removing all of the fetters of this hated treaty. This is the set of concepts with which he worked. He was an opportunist. He was capable of making an alliance on Monday, breaking it on Tuesday, making short-term agreements with, as we will see, the Soviet Union in 1939, when it suited his purposes, only to shift a bit later on. But these concepts, these notions, were clearly behind Hitler's foreign policy from the beginning of his career down to the last days in the bunker in 1945. In 1933, when Hitler came to power, and really into 1934, he was in no position to embark upon an adventurous foreign policy. Instead, those years, as I said earlier, were devoted largely to a consolidation of his control over Germany itself. But one does see in 1933-34 some previews of Nazi foreign policy and also his modus operandi, the way Hitler operated. None better, I think, than his handling of the Disarmament Conference of 1932-33 and the League of Nations. When Hitler came into power in January of 1933, Germany was already a participant in an international disarmament conference. It had begun in 1932. Hitler comes to power, and really his first initiative on the international scene had to do with this disarmament conference. Now you'll recall that the Treaty of Versailles had restricted Germany's armed forces considerably. 100,000 troops was the maximum, no tanks, no artillery, no air force, and so on. At the disarmament conference, Hitler instructed his representatives to make a daring proposal. Germany, he argued, would completely disarm, give up all of its armaments, all 100,000, if France, Great Britain, Japan, the United States, and so on would do the same. Well, this was an offer that he correctly assumed would be refused, and in fact, France balked. And as soon as France did, Hitler had exactly what he wanted. He went back to the German population and said, you see, the Treaty of Versailles, this disarmament, this is all a ruse. This is not about equality. This is not about disarmament. This is not about world peace. This is one more attempt to enforce this corrupt and miserable treaty. We offered them complete disarmament. If that's what they wanted, they could have had it. But they didn't want it. All they wanted to do was to keep Germany in this position of this oppressed condition. Hitler then withdrew from the conference with great fanfare and withdrew from the League of Nations also in 1933, which had sponsored and was involved with the conference. This was absolutely quintessential Hitler. On the one hand, it's aggressive. He's withdrawing from this disarmament conference. On the other hand, Hitler always cloaked, right down to the time the first shots were fired on September 1st, 1939. Always cloaked his very aggressive policies in a rhetorical garb that emphasized Germany's demand for justice, Germany's demand for equality, Germany's demand to be treated as an equal in the international community. Germany should no longer be a second-class citizen. This played very, very well in Germany, and over time it also had a corrosive effect on the resolve of the Allies, especially in Great Britain. Those two, his withdrawal from the disarmament conference and his withdrawal from the League of Nations then, really give us a glimpse of the way Hitler liked to operate. In 1934, he surprised a great many people by signing a 10-year non-aggression pact with Poland. Now, for those people who'd been reading Mein Kampf or who had listened to Hitler's speeches, the discussion of Lebensraum, you think, well, Lebensraum is going to come to the east. It's got to be Poland. They've got to be victim number one. And yet, in 1934, the National Socialist regime signs a non-aggression pact with the Polish state. What this did was to strike a blow at the French alliance system. France, as you'll recall, had been trying to establish a series of alliances with the so-called successor states. Poland was the key to this, with its frontier right, its common frontier with Germany. And now the Germans had plucked Poland from this French alliance system with this non-aggression pact. In 1935, Hitler was in a much stronger position domestically. Paul von Hindenburg, the old Reich president, passed away in 1934, and Hitler was able to assume the position of Reich president and also head of the armed forces. The German army swore an oath of allegiance directly to Hitler. His position at home was very, very solid. Hitler had been, ever since his withdrawal from the non-aggression conference, Hitler had been making, I suppose we would say that now they would be called leaks of information, that Germany, having withdrawn from the disarmament conference, was also not going to abide by the disarmament clauses of the Treaty of Versailles, that the Allies had already lost whatever justification they had for this. Then in March of 1935, Hitler made a formal announcement. Germany had, in fact, he revealed, been building an air force. a Luftwaffe, as it was called, and would henceforth move on to do this in a formal, public way. Germany was going to build an air force. Why? Britain had an air force, France had an air force, Poland had an air force. Germany needed an air force just for its own protection. This was not an act of aggression. This was not a provocative act. This was simply Germany declaring that it needed to defend itself. 1 week later, when there had been no real outcry, there was a certain amount of blustering and complaint in the League of Nations, in Paris, and in London, but nothing more than that. 1 week later, Hitler announced his intention to introduce conscription. He was going to build an army, he announced, of 500,000 men, and then continue to expand it thereafter. Once again, the League protested, but there was no action taken. No action from Paris, no action from Britain, and now what Hitler had done by 1935 then was he had completely destroyed the disarmament clauses of the Treaty of Versailles. Then, in 1935, the cruelest blow of all for France. The two powers that were really seen by the French and the world as the enforcers of the treaty, France foremost, and more reluctantly, Great Britain, now suffered a real split. In June of 1935, France was horrified to discover that Great Britain had entered into a naval agreement with Germany. The British had done this without consulting either the French or the Italians, who at this point were still seen as potential allies. And in this agreement, Great Britain recognized Germany's right to build a navy up to 35% of Britain's surface tonnage and 60% of British submarine strength. In other words, what the British had done was to cut a deal with Hitler. In a sense, what this reveals is the British had already given up on Versailles. They'd given up on disarmament. They'd given up on the enforcing any sort of military strictures on Germany, and opted to cut their own deal with Germany on the one thing that really mattered most to Britain, and that was the Navy. So they now, if Versailles had any breath left in it at all, this blow from Britain certainly, I think, was the end for Versailles. In March of 1936, then, Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland. It was French territory, or German territory, rather. But as you'll recall from the Treaty of Versailles, had been a demilitarized zone. It was crucial to the French position in Europe that that zone in Germany remained demilitarized, because this gave the French a clear avenue into the heartland of Germany, directly to the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of the country, without any opposition. As soon as the Germans sent troops back into the Rhineland, as soon as they remilitarized the Rhineland, France's ability to influence events in Germany, not to mention to protect their alliance partners in the East, was gone. French military commanders urged caution, and the British opposed military intervention. The matter was referred to the League of Nations, which did nothing. The Germans, we now know, the German high command, had not been in favor of this move at all. In fact, Hitler had been told by his military commanders, if the French send a regiment out there, we'll be humiliated. We couldn't possibly defend ourselves against the French, who had the largest army in Europe at the time. Hitler gambled, he won. The remilitarization of the Rhineland represents now, I think, this relentless pressure that Hitler was asserting. Pressure constantly, all in one direction, revision of the treaty, or destruction of the treaty. And his prestige in Germany and in the international community soared. Not only the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, but also what was the great coup for Hitler's foreign policy, not in any power political way, but in terms of German prestige in 1936, was of course the holding of the Olympic Games in Berlin. We tend to think of this, there's one story that Americans seem to know about the 1936 Olympics, and that's of course is Jesse Owens' terrific performance there, and the embarrassment it caused Hitler to have to acknowledge that here's a black man, an African American, how does this fit with his racial notion of Aryans and so on. But for the German point of view, the Olympics were a terrific success. The world had come to Berlin. Germany was back. And not only that, the Germans won the 1936 Olympics on points, all of these obscure events, not the track and field things that the Americans dominated. But by 1936, the Treaty of Versailles and the system of collective security that the framers of that treaty had sought to create was largely dead. Largely dead.